It was a calm and peaceful afternoon when Greg Thompson's private jet touched down on the runway. He had just returned from a successful business trip, one of many in his career. As a well-established entrepreneur, Greg was used to flying in style and comfort. His private jet, sleek and modern, had become a symbol of his hard work and success. Every flight was a chance to relax and think about the next big idea. Greg sat back in his seat, staring out the window as the plane made its descent. He could already picture the evening ahead, getting home to his family, catching up with his wife, and spending time with his two kids. The past few days had been filled with meetings and business deals, but now it was time to unwind. As the jet landed smoothly and taxied toward its private hangar, Greg smiled to himself. Life had been good to him. His business ventures had flourished, and he had managed to maintain a work-life balance that allowed him to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Greg had come a long way from where he started, and he was proud of everything he had achieved. The plane came to a stop, and Greg's mind shifted to the simple joy of getting home. He could already hear the laughter of his children in his mind, the welcoming hug from his wife, and the warmth of being surrounded by loved ones. He took a deep breath, feeling grateful for the life he had built. However, as the jet's engines powered down, Greg noticed something strange. A few cars, which appeared to be unmarked police vehicles, were parked near the hangar. At first, he thought little of it, maybe a routine security check, or perhaps the airport authorities needed to speak to him about something. But as he looked more closely, a sense of unease began to creep in. Something didn't feel right. The moment he stepped off the jet and onto the tarmac, a group of officers in plain clothes approached him. Greg felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had no idea who these people were or why they were here. The leader of the group, a tall officer with a stern expression, stepped forward and flashed his badge. "Mr. Thompson?" the officer asked. Greg nodded, a bit confused, unsure of what was going on. "We need you to step aside for a moment, sir. We have some questions regarding your arrival," the officer continued, his voice firm but not unfriendly. Greg raised an eyebrow. Questions? About what? He had followed every legal procedure, filed all his paperwork, and done nothing out of the ordinary. His business was legitimate, his wealth well-earned. He didn't understand why they would want to speak to him. "We'll explain in a moment," the officer said, motioning for Greg to follow them. "We just need to clear up a few things before you leave." Greg felt a mix of confusion and frustration. He was tired, ready to go home, and now he was being asked to stop and answer questions for a reason he couldn't understand. With no other choice, he followed them, still unsure of what was happening. The officers led him to one of the police vehicles parked nearby. They didn't seem aggressive, but there was a sense of urgency in their movements that made Greg feel even more uneasy. His mind raced with questions, but he kept his composure. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. It had to be. Little did Greg know, the misunderstanding was just beginning. As Greg followed the officers toward the unmarked police cars, he couldn't help but feel more confused by the minute. He had just stepped off his private jet, after a long, tiring flight, and all he wanted was to go home. But now it seemed like something was wrong, and he couldn't understand what it was. "Excuse me, but could you tell me what this is about?" Greg asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer who had spoken to him earlier didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for Greg to sit in one of the cars, and after a few moments, he reluctantly obeyed. Inside the vehicle, Greg felt the tension building. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. He was sure he hadn't done anything wrong. So why was this happening? Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe a mix-up with his flight details, but something in the way the officers were acting told him this was more than just a simple mistake. The officer who had first approached him, the one with the stern expression, finally spoke. "Mr. Thompson, we've received a tip about suspicious activity on your jet. We need to search the plane to make sure everything is in order." Greg stared at him in disbelief. Suspicious activity. He had been in business for years, and his company was well known for its clean track record. He had nothing to hide, and there was no reason for the authorities to treat him like this. "I don't understand," Greg said, trying to remain calm, though his frustration was beginning to show. "There's nothing on that jet except me and my crew. I have all the proper documentation. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I don't know why you'd get a tip about my plane." The officer just nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "I'm sorry, sir. I know this isn't easy, but we have to follow through. It's standard procedure." Greg looked out the window, trying to gather his thoughts. He felt the weight of the situation, the strange feeling that the officers weren't seeing him for who he really was. Instead, they seemed to have already made up their minds about him. It wasn't just about his jet. It was about who he was. More officers appeared at the jet, and Greg could see them preparing to board it. He wanted to say something, to demand answers, but it felt like no one was listening. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. He had worked so hard to get where he was. The jet was a reward for his years of effort, but now it felt like a symbol of something else, a target on his back. Minutes passed, and Greg sat in the car, trying to calm himself. He thought about his family waiting at home, about the time he had planned to spend with them. He just wanted this whole thing to be over so he could go back to his normal life. But the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every few minutes, another officer would approach the car and exchange quick words with the ones inside. Greg still wasn't sure what was happening. His frustration grew as time ticked by. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officers began to return to their vehicles, their faces serious. Greg was told they would be continuing the investigation inside the jet, but he wasn't allowed to leave just yet. He had no choice but to wait, and as he sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He wasn't just a man with a jet. In the eyes of these officers, he had become a suspect, someone to be questioned, someone to be treated like a criminal. He sat back in the seat, his thoughts swirling. Would he ever get to go home? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? The tension inside the police car was thick, and Greg couldn't help but feel like something was slipping out of his control. He sat quietly, trying to understand what was happening. The officer who had first spoken to him remained outside, exchanging brief words with the others. Greg shifted in his seat, his mind racing. A few moments later, the officer returned to the car and opened the door. He didn't say much, but his expression had changed. There was something in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty, but also a firm resolve. "Mr. Thompson, we're placing you under arrest," the officer announced, his voice steady. Greg blinked in disbelief. "What? Arrest? For what? I haven't done anything wrong." "I understand this may be difficult to understand, but we need to take you in for questioning. We've been informed of suspicious activity, and we need to conduct a full investigation," the officer explained, his tone colder now. "Please step out of the vehicle." Greg sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. This wasn't what he had expected. Arrested. For what? He had followed all the rules, paid for everything legitimately, and yet now he was being treated like a criminal. He wasn't sure how to respond. The calm, professional side of him tried to make sense of the situation, but inside, he felt a wave of anger and confusion. "Are you serious?" Greg said, his voice shaking with frustration. "I don't understand what's happening here. I have nothing to hide. This is a mistake." The officer didn't respond immediately, but motioned for him to step out of the car again. Greg knew he had no choice. He couldn't resist or argue anymore. His hands were shaking as he slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The weight of the handcuffs was a sharp reminder that this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had escalated into something far more serious. As Greg was led toward the police vehicle, he felt the sting of the cold metal cuffs around his wrists. He didn't resist. He couldn't. He was being arrested, and no matter how hard he tried to explain himself, It felt like the officers weren't listening. They had already made their decision. "Mr. Thompson, we'll sort this out," the officer said, but there was little comfort in his words. Greg knew that, whatever this was, it was far from over. The officers led him toward a waiting patrol car, where Greg would be taken to the station for further questioning. As he walked toward the car, he saw the officers from earlier returning to the jet, still searching the plane as if they were sure they would find something. Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking for any excuse to confirm their suspicions. They didn't know him, didn't understand who he was, or what he had built. To them, he was just another person who had something they didn't understand. Maybe it was the private jet, or maybe it was because he was a successful black businessman. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. All that mattered now was that he was being treated as a suspect, someone to be questioned and interrogated. As he was pushed into the back of the patrol car, Greg tried to keep calm. But inside, the confusion and anger were starting to boil over. How could they do this to him? What had gone so wrong? As the car started moving, Greg looked out of the window at the small airport, feeling disconnected from everything he knew. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but he couldn't understand how it had come to this. He had always done everything by the book. He had never broken a law, never hurt anyone. Yet here he was, under arrest, for no reason he could see. The uncertainty hung over him as the car drove off, and Greg couldn't help but wonder. How would he prove his innocence? Would he even get the chance to do so? The ride to the police station was silent, except for the occasional hum of the engine. Greg sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed, staring out the window as the city passed by. His mind was racing. How had things gotten this far? He had always been careful to follow the law, to make sure everything in his life was above board. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. As the car pulled up to the station, Greg felt a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief. The officers who had arrested him opened the door and led him into the building. His movements were stiff, his steps heavy with the weight of the situation. He tried to keep calm, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. Why? Why was this happening to him? They brought him into an interrogation room, a small plain space with a single table and 2 chairs. Greg was instructed to sit down, and the officers removed his cuffs, though the atmosphere in the room still felt charged. The door clicked shut, and Greg was left alone with his thoughts. For the next few minutes, the officers didn't say much. They stood off to the side, talking quietly among themselves, as if unsure of how to proceed. Greg watched them, growing more frustrated with every second. He had no idea what they were looking for, but it was clear that they weren't going to let him go until they had answers. Answers that he didn't even know how to give. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer who had initially approached Greg stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice a little softer than before, "we've been reviewing your information. We need to ask you a few more questions." Greg nodded, doing his best to stay calm. "I've already told you everything I know. I'm just trying to understand what's going on. There's no reason for this." The officer glanced at the file in his hands before looking back at Greg. "We've been going over your records, and we found something unusual. We need to figure out what's going on." Greg's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back and motioned to one of his colleagues, who brought over a stack of papers. They seemed to be going over something in the documents carefully, exchanging quiet words. Greg's mind raced. What could they have possibly found? Was this some kind of misunderstanding with his paperwork? Then the officer returned to the table with a new set of papers in hand. He laid them out in front of Greg. The documents listed everything about his business ventures, his name, his investments, his properties. As the officer flipped through the pages, he paused at one specific document, and Greg felt a sudden tension in the room. "We've been going over your file," the officer said again, his voice quieter now. "And we just realized you're not who we thought you were." Greg's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? I've been telling you the truth the whole time. I'm Greg Thompson, a businessman. You have all the information right there." The officer shook his head. "It's not that simple. We've checked your name, your business, your reputation, even. You're a highly respected entrepreneur, and we had no idea. You see, when we first received the tip about suspicious activity, we didn't realize you were the person involved." Greg sat back, stunned. "So you arrested me because you didn't know who I was?" The officer sighed deeply. "I'm afraid so. We didn't realize that you were a legitimate businessman. There was no criminal activity connected to your jet or your records. It was a mistake." Greg sat in silence for a moment, absorbing what the officer had just said. He couldn't believe it. The entire ordeal had been based on assumptions, on mistakes, and now they were telling him that he was innocent. But the damage had already been done. He had been treated like a criminal, his life turned upside down for something he hadn't done. "I need to speak to my lawyer," Greg said firmly, his voice steady now, but there was a quiet anger beneath it. "This is unacceptable." The officer nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "We understand, Mr. Thompson. We'll get in touch with your lawyer immediately." Greg's mind was still reeling from the realization. He had been arrested for no reason other than a mix-up, and now they were admitting their mistake. But the damage to his reputation was already done. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an example of how easily someone could be wrongly accused, based on nothing more than assumptions. As the officer left the room to arrange for Greg's lawyer, he couldn't help but wonder. How many others had been caught up in situations like this, simply because of who they were or what they had? The feeling of injustice lingered in the room, but Greg knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Greg sat in the small, sterile interrogation room, still trying to process everything that had happened. He had been arrested, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal, all because of a mistake. The officers hadn't known who he was, and now they were starting to realize that they had made a serious error, but the realization came too late. The damage had already been done, and Greg was left to deal with the fallout. The officer who had spoken to him earlier returned to the room, this time with a slightly more apologetic look on his face. He stood silently for a moment, then finally spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology," the officer began, his voice calm but filled with regret. "We've done some further checks, and I have to admit, we were wrong. There's no criminal activity associated with your name. This whole thing was a misunderstanding, and we deeply regret what's happened." Greg took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger and frustration that had been building up inside him. "So you're telling me that all of this, being arrested, detained, treated like a criminal, was all because you didn't bother to check who I really was?" His voice was steady, but the hurt and frustration were clear. The officer nodded. "We received an anonymous tip that led us to believe there was something suspicious going on. We acted on that information without fully verifying it. It was an error, and I understand how this has affected you." Greg's hands clenched into fists. The apology was nice, but it didn't change the fact that he had been wrongfully detained. "I've worked hard to get to where I am. I've built a business, a reputation, and now you're telling me that everything I've worked for could have been ruined in an instant because you didn't do your job properly." The officer seemed to understand Greg's anger, but he didn't offer a defense. "You're right, Mr. Thompson, and I am truly sorry for how this has turned out. This should never have happened, and we're going to do everything we can to make this right." Greg leaned back in his chair, his mind still racing. "How exactly do you plan on making this right? You've already damaged my reputation, made me feel like I was doing something wrong. How do you fix that?" The officer paused, clearly thinking about Greg's words. "We're going to issue a formal apology, of course, and we'll work to ensure this doesn't happen again. We'll also clear your name publicly to make sure the misunderstanding is known for what it was." Greg looked at the officer, not sure if he was being sincere or if it was just something they said to get him to calm down. The damage was already done. The fear, the confusion, and the anger he had felt in the last few hours couldn't be undone by a simple apology. "I appreciate the apology," Greg said slowly, "but it doesn't erase what's happened. You've put me in a position where I have to explain myself to people who never should have questioned me in the first place. How do you undo that?" The officer didn't have an immediate answer. He seemed to be at a loss for words. Greg could see that he was genuinely remorseful, but the damage was done. The feeling of being wrongly accused was something Greg couldn't shake. It was a harsh reminder of how easy it was for people to be judged based on assumptions, based on what others thought they knew. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," Greg said firmly, standing up from his seat. "I need to make sure this never happens again, to me or anyone else." The officer nodded, not arguing. "We understand. We'll cooperate fully." As Greg left the interrogation room, he couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. This was about the way people were treated based on their race, their success, and the way others viewed them. Greg had been targeted and arrested because of a mistake, but it had opened his eyes to how easily someone could be treated unfairly. As he walked out of the station, Greg's mind was already turning to the next steps. He was determined to ensure that what had happened to him would not happen to anyone else. Greg sat in the small waiting area of the police station, still trying to wrap his mind around everything that had just happened. The officers had finally cleared his name, admitted their mistake, and promised to make things right. Yet, despite their apologies, he couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. How had it all gotten this far? How had he, a successful businessman with a legitimate reputation, been treated like a criminal? He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. The moment the officers had approached him on the tarmac, the confusion as they handcuffed him, and the humiliation of being led through the police station in front of complete strangers. Greg had worked so hard to build his life, and in one afternoon, it had all been thrown into chaos. His reputation, the trust he had spent years earning, now hung in the balance. The door to the waiting room opened, and the officer who had initially arrested him walked in. He wasn't alone this time. The police chief had accompanied him, and both men looked somewhat uneasy. Greg stood up as they entered, his expression firm but still filled with frustration. "Mr. Thompson," the officer began, his voice quieter than before, "I want to apologize again for the confusion. We have reviewed the case thoroughly, and we now understand that you had no involvement in any criminal activity. I sincerely regret the trouble this has caused you." The police chief nodded in agreement. "We take full responsibility for what happened. The officers acted based on incomplete information, and we are deeply sorry. This should have never occurred." Greg's eyes narrowed slightly, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't erase the fact that I was wrongfully detained. I've been treated like a criminal for something I had no control over. It's hard to just forget that." The officer looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I understand, Mr. Thompson, and I assure you, we're doing everything we can to fix it. We'll clear your name publicly, and we'll make sure everyone knows this was an error." Greg shook his head slowly. "It's not just about clearing my name. It's about how easily this could have happened to someone else. How quickly people can make assumptions, how quickly they can jump to conclusions based on nothing more than a stereotype or a wrong tip. I'm lucky I had the resources to fight this, but what about others who don't?" The police chief's expression softened. "You're right. This situation highlights a bigger issue, and we're aware of that. We'll make sure our procedures are reviewed so that something like this doesn't happen again." Greg sighed deeply, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "You say you'll fix it, but the damage is already done. My reputation was questioned, my business could have been harmed, and I've had to explain myself to people who should never have doubted me." The officer nodded, his face full of regret. "We can't undo what's been done, But we will do everything in our power to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Your story will be shared, and we will work with the community to rebuild the trust that was broken." Greg leaned back against the wall, his frustration still simmering beneath the surface. "I've been wronged, and I can't just walk away from that. I need to think about how I move forward, how I can make sure something like this doesn't happen to someone else." The police chief looked at Greg, understanding the weight of his words. "We will cooperate fully, Mr. Thompson. We'll work together to make sure this never happens again. We'll also ensure that you receive a formal apology, and we will be transparent about what happened." Greg looked at them both, still processing everything. The officers seemed genuine in their apology, but the damage was real. He had been wronged in a way he could never fully forget. Yet Greg knew that the only way forward was to continue pushing for change. He couldn't undo the past, but he could use his experience to help others and to make sure no one else went through what he had. As the meeting came to a close, Greg stood up, his thoughts still heavy. "I'll be in touch with my lawyer, and I'll expect the public apology. But for now, I need to take the next steps and figure out how to move forward." With that, he left the police station, the weight of the ordeal still with him. But in his mind, a new determination had started to grow. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been unjustly treated or wrongly accused. And Greg knew that his fight wasn't over. As Greg walked out of the police station, he couldn't help but feel a weight on his shoulders. The officers had apologized, and the police chief had promised to make things right. But it didn't change the fact that his life had been turned upside down. It had all happened so quickly. One moment, he was flying home, excited to see his family, and the next, he was being arrested without explanation. His phone buzzed as he stepped outside, and he saw dozens of missed calls and text messages. His heart sank as he scrolled through them. Friends, family, colleagues, everyone had heard about his arrest. News of the incident had already started to spread. And now, Greg's name was all over the headlines. The confusion, anger, and frustration from earlier were now mixed with a new feeling: humiliation. He had spent years building his business, his reputation, and his life. Now, all of that was being questioned because of a mistake. The media had picked up the story quickly, and the phone calls weren't just from friends. They were from reporters, eager to get his side of the story. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. People were watching, and they wanted answers. Greg's mind raced as he read through the news articles. Some of them were sympathetic, acknowledging the mistake and the apology from the police. But others were more skeptical, casting doubt on his character. The stories were full of assumptions about why the police had been called, about the jet, about him. It felt like he was being judged without a fair chance to explain. But amid the confusion, something surprising began to happen. The public began to rally behind him. Social media lit up with messages of support. People were angry, not just at the police, but at the way Greg had been treated. Hashtags like #JusticeForGreg and #EndRacial Profiling began trending, and messages of solidarity poured in from all over. One post from a well-known public figure caught Greg's attention. It read, "We cannot let this continue. No one should be treated like a criminal based on assumptions. We stand with Greg Thompson." The post was shared thousands of times, and soon, more celebrities and public figures were speaking out in his defense. Even regular people who had never met Greg were coming together, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment and supporting his fight for justice. Greg had always been a private person, but now his situation had become bigger than himself. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and it both comforted and frustrated him. He appreciated the solidarity, but it also made him realize just how much harm had been done. His reputation was being shaped by a public narrative that he hadn't had a chance to control. The damage was done, and he didn't know how to undo it. Still, Greg couldn't help but feel grateful for the support. People were taking notice, and they were calling for change. As the news continued to spread, The conversation shifted to something bigger, the issue of racial profiling. People were talking about the ways in which black men and women were often treated unfairly by the authorities. Greg's story had become a symbol of something much larger than just his personal experience. It was a reflection of the challenges faced by many people in the black community. As the days passed, Greg found himself speaking to the media. He told his story, explaining how the officers had wrongly assumed he was involved in illegal activity simply because of his success and the appearance of his jet. He spoke about the impact the arrest had on his life and his business, but also about the importance of addressing the deeper issues at play, issues of race, discrimination, and the need for reform in the way the police interacted with people of color. Greg knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but as the public support grew, so did his determination. He wasn't just going to let this incident be forgotten. He would use this moment to raise awareness, to speak out for those who had been unfairly treated, and to demand change. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to face what he had faced. And with the growing public outrage and the attention his story had garnered, Greg knew he had a platform to make a difference. As the days passed, the storm of media attention began to grow louder. Greg's story was no longer just a local news event. It had captured national attention. His wrongful arrest had become a symbol of something far larger than his own experience. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also brought a new sense of responsibility. Greg was no longer just fighting to clear his name. He was now a voice for many others who had faced the same kind of injustice. The conversations about racial profiling, inequality, and the need for police reform were now part of the public discourse. Greg found himself at the center of these discussions, giving interviews, speaking at press conferences, and joining in on public forums. It wasn't easy. He was still processing the trauma of everything that had happened, but he knew that this was a chance to make a real impact. Every time he spoke, the same message echoed in his mind. No one should be judged or mistreated based on assumptions or stereotypes. He had been wrongfully arrested because of the color of his skin and the appearance of his jet, both of which had been used against him in ways he couldn't have imagined. It was a harsh reminder of how easily the system could turn against someone, especially someone who didn't fit the stereotype of who belongs in certain spaces. But Greg wasn't just a victim. He was determined to use his platform to fight for change. He had learned the hard way that things wouldn't change unless people stood up and spoke out, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. His experience had opened his eyes to the unfairness many people faced every day. And now he was committed to helping lead the charge for a more just system. One afternoon, Greg gave a powerful interview on a national news program. The interviewer asked him what he wanted to see happen next, now that the public's attention was on him. "I want to see real change," Greg said, his voice firm but calm. "I want to see a world where people aren't treated differently because of the color of their skin or their background. I want the system to work for everyone, not just a select few. The fact that I'm standing here after being wrongfully arrested should be a wake-up call. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire studio seemed to pause. Greg wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for anyone who had ever been unfairly targeted, anyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. And as the interview ended, it was clear that his message had struck a chord with millions of viewers. Across social media, support continued to flood in. People from all walks of life were sharing his message, tagging their local representatives, and calling for police reform. Some were even organizing protests and petitions, demanding action to prevent the kind of racial profiling that had led to Greg's arrest. Greg's phone rang constantly with messages of support, but also with requests for him to get involved in various initiatives, all aimed at ending racial inequality. For the first time since his wrongful arrest, Greg felt like his voice was being heard, and that it could actually make a difference. But he also knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. The road ahead was long, and it would take more than just words to create a real impact. He would need to keep pushing, keep speaking out, and keep working alongside others who were committed to making the world a fairer place for everyone. I didn't ask for this attention, Greg said in a meeting with a group of activists. But now that I have it, I'm going to use it to help bring about the change we all deserve. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. The room fell silent as everyone took in Greg's words. The group knew that his story had started a conversation, but it was only the beginning. Together, they would continue to fight for justice, to make sure that no one else would have to face the same kind of unfair treatment that Greg had experienced. And with his leadership, the movement for change was only gaining momentum. Greg's journey since the wrongful arrest had been difficult, but as the weeks went by, he could feel the shift. His voice was being heard. The support from the public was overwhelming, and the conversations around racial profiling and police reform were gaining momentum. What had started as a personal struggle had now turned into a movement, and Greg was at the center of it. He continued to speak out in interviews and meetings, and every time he spoke, more people began to listen. His experiences had resonated with so many others who had been wronged in similar ways. Greg knew that his story wasn't just about him anymore. It was a call for change that many had been waiting for. But even as he took on this new role as an advocate for justice, Greg couldn't ignore the emotional toll it had taken on him. He thought about the moments of fear, confusion, and anger that had overwhelmed him during his arrest. He thought about how quickly the police had assumed the worst of him, simply because of the way he looked. It wasn't something that could be easily forgotten, and Greg had moments where the weight of it all felt like too much. But every time he felt the weight of doubt, the words of support from strangers, from people he'd never met, kept him going. He had become a symbol of something much bigger, a reminder that justice wasn't something that could be taken for granted, that everyone deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their race or background. One day, Greg was invited to speak at a rally for police reform. It was one of the largest rallies he had seen, with thousands of people gathered to demand change. As he stepped onto the stage, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but there was no fear. He had come to realize that his fight was not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of others who had faced the same injustice. "Thank you for standing with me," Greg began, his voice steady and strong. "This isn't just about my story. This is about all of us. It's about the countless people who are wrongfully accused, the people who are treated as suspects before they're even given a chance to explain themselves. We are all deserving of respect. We all deserve to be treated fairly." The crowd erupted in applause. Greg paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the power of the moment. It was hard to believe how far he had come. From being wrongfully arrested to standing in front of thousands of people, calling for a change that he knew was necessary. "I never imagined that I would be standing here today," Greg continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But what happened to me is a reality for many people every day. And it has to stop. We need to ensure that no one else is ever treated the way I was. We need to hold the system accountable." As Greg spoke, he could see the faces of people in the crowd nodding in agreement. He could feel the collective energy of the movement growing stronger. This was no longer just a fight for one person's justice. It was a fight for everyone. In the weeks that followed, the rally and Greg's speech made headlines. The momentum for police reform grew even more, and Greg's story became a central piece of the conversation about racial justice. Lawmakers and community leaders reached out to him, eager to hear his perspective and involve him in discussions about real change. Greg had started his journey seeking justice for himself, but now he had become a leader in a movement for change that went far beyond his own experience. He had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was power in using your voice, in standing up for what was right. And while Greg knew that true change would take time, he was more determined than ever to keep fighting. For himself, for those who had supported him, and for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of who they were. His story was far from over, but it had already made a lasting impact.